we're going to have a panel discussion here very shortly on the redistricting process, what's going on in other states, what kinds of reforms have been considered, and what kinds of reforms have actually been approved, and what are the different components of some of those reforms. And I will introduce our panel in just a minute. A couple of things I want to touch upon, though, before we do that, one of which is the panel that preceded us in the morning talked about various reforms that might also be attempted, and the list of those potential reforms was developed in part through a survey, which many of you may have participated in. And one of the questions that we had, which we didn't get a chance to get to, was why didn't that survey include redistricting reform? Does that mean that we're not going forward with, are we not pursuing redistricting reform? Are we giving up? Well, certainly not. I'm here to tell you, definitely not. And we will be going forward in the new session, and we are going to succeed this time. A couple things you may have heard. Thank you. Thank you. I think probably most of you heard about the governor's executive order, which he announced. We have a representative of the governor's office here with us today, who I will name only if he wants me to, but we do have a representative from Governor Wolf's office here today. And also we have staff from legislative offices as well, and also several members, and you'll meet some of them in the next panel talking about possible changes to the House rules. And they will introduce themselves at that time, but there is at least one other member that I know of who is here today, newly elected member, Representative Wendy Ullman from the 143rd District, which includes Doylestown and the Central Bucks. Are you here? Could you? Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us. The governor's executive order, what it does is to create a panel of experts who are going to study the issue of redistricting, look at best practices around the country, hear from the people, hear from experts and so forth, and make recommendations to the governor and to the leaders of the General Assembly on the kinds of reforms, the kinds of transparency, the kinds of other considerations that ought to be part of the next redistricting, really even regardless of whether we have an independent commission in place by that time. We hope that we will, and we hope that that panel will include among its recommendations that there in fact be an independent commission to draw the lines for both congressional and for legislative districts in 2021. But I think part of the idea here for the governor's panel is that they will make recommendations that can be implemented regardless of whether we have an independent panel or we have the existing process with all of its flaws. But we want to thank the governor for the action that he took. One question that has come up, I'm going to field this one right away. We'll get to other questions later, but how does this play in the governor's panel? How does this play into what we want to do? Is it an alternative? Is it something that will in some way make it more difficult for us to get an independent commission, or will it provide to the legislature an excuse where they can delay and say, well, we're not moving forward because the governor appointed a panel who's looking at some of these issues? Well, one thing I know from my long experience in state government, the General Assembly and the leaders in particular, they don't need an excuse. If they decide they don't want to do something, then they're not going to do it, and they may use that as their excuse. But if they also decide that it's the right thing to do either for political reasons or otherwise, to create an independent commission, then they're going to move forward, and they're not going to worry about the fact that Governor Wolf has a commission or has a panel that is, holding hearings and so forth. So, but just finally on that point, I do want to give credit to the governor. Some points that he made in his executive order. The success of our democracy demands fair, equitable elections. Citizens are entitled to accuracy and transparency in the election process and government that works on behalf of all Pennsylvanians. Pennsylvania residents have overwhelmingly expressed their desire for an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission to oversee the legislative redistricting process. So he's right with us on that. And again, we thank you. We thank him again very much for that. This question, probably will come up. I also want to address this right off the bat because I know people are asking, what are we going to do in the new session? We missed a deadline that we said exists. We had to get a constitutional amendment approved in 2 consecutive sessions. The first session, it had to be done by a certain deadline. That deadline is passed. Aren't we now dead in the water? Well, there actually is still a road forward. There is still a way we can get this done. And it is tight and it's a little complicated. And I'll see if I can summarize it for you. This time around in 2019, very early in 2019, we're going to have 2 bills introduced. One will amend a state statute, most likely the election code, and will create an independent commission for congressional redistricting, which can be done by state statute, does not require amending the Constitution. We'll also have a bill that will again amend the Constitution to create an independent commission for state, House, and Senate districts. The one that amends state law for congressional districts can be enacted relatively soon, if the will is there, in the 2019-2020 2-year session of the General Assembly. That commission can then be, the mechanics of appointing the members, putting the commission in place, doing all that it needs to do to start collecting data, scheduling hearings, and so forth, can be moving forward in 2020 at the same time that we are pushing forward on the constitutional amendment that has to be passed in the 2019-2020 session for the first time, okay? So in 2020, you have a commission up and running for congressional districts, and then you have to come back in the next 2-year session in 2021, very early in that session, granted, and have the General Assembly pass the constitutional amendment for the second time. At that point, the question will be put on the ballot in May of 2021. The congressional panel, independent commission, will be in place, and if the voters approve the constitutional amendment for State, House, and Senate, then that can just be handed off to the existing commission that we've already got up and running for congressional districts. Does that make sense? Now, that's a tight time frame. That means that the first time the General Assembly passes the constitutional amendment, we assume they did it in good faith, and that in February of 2021, they'll do it again in time to get it on the ballot for May. So that's the plan. And as I say, it's a 2-bill strategy, which means we have a need for prime sponsors for 2 bills. And so in the House, we're going to have 2 prime sponsors, and the Senate will have 2 prime sponsors. This time around, whereas last time we had Democrats as prime sponsors for our bills, the 1 bill that we had in the House and the 1 bill that we had in the Senate, this time we're going to have 1 Democrat as a prime sponsor of one of the bills and a Republican as a prime sponsor of the other bill in both House and Senate. On the Democratic side, again, our champion, Steve Samuelson, who is here. Are you still here? Steve is here, and he will be on the panel that comes after our panel, talking about the House rules. Our House Republican sponsor happens to be my own local state representative, Thomas Mert, from Montgomery County, who represents the Hatboro, Upper Moreland area and Huntington Valley area, that district. Bryn Athyn, thank you, Bryn Athyn. Representative Mert is, he has been a co-sponsor in the past of our bill and other bills on this topic, and he is happy and really anxious to get involved as the prime sponsor. He'll be the first co-sponsor on Steve's bill. Steve will be the first co-sponsor on Tom Mert's bill. And so we are working on the Senate, which I'm not yet ready to announce how that's going to happen, but we're working on the Senate side as well. So that's the plan. We're still in this, and this time we're going to win with your help. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. We had originally had 3 panelists, including Annabelle Harless from the Campaign Legal Center. Unfortunately, she came down with the flu and was unable to join us. So we're going to carry on with our 2 panelists and myself, and we will also take questions at the end of their presentations. So the panel today includes Yurij Rudensky, to my left, who is counsel with the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. His work focuses primarily on redistricting litigation and redistricting reform legislation. Yurij is a seasoned litigator. He's written federal bills and served as a law clerk to the Honorable Salvador Mendoza, Jr. of the U.S. District Court, Eastern District of Washington, and for the Honorable Stephen Gonzalez, Justice on the State of Washington Supreme Court. Sam Wang is founder of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, a professor of neuroscience and molecular biology at Princeton University, faculty associate in law and public affairs. He's well known for developing statistical methods to analyze United States elections and is the author of several works on statistical methods to detect partisan bias in redistricting. His election work has won awards from the Washington Post and from Common Cause. He's been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Los Angeles Times, among other publications. So we're going to begin. Thank you. Please. And we'll begin with Yurij Rudensky. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Great crowd. And as always, you know, one of the things we at the Brennan Center, and I'll tell you a little bit about it and how we do our work, but we work with a lot of groups around the country. We were working with the campaigns in the 5 states that passed redistricting reform in 2018. And one of the things that we've always been incredibly impressed with Fair Districts PA is just how well you organize, how well you turn people out, and it's really a wonderful thing. So the Brennan Center, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works on reforming and revitalizing our systems of democracy. And redistricting reform has been a central pillar of that work since the center was founded in 1995. And the way we do our work is as a national technical support center, and really that is how we think of ourselves when we are in the policy space. We work with state and national legislators. We work with state and national civil rights and good government groups to try to find solutions that promote best redistricting practices. And what that means is processes that are transparent and that are community-driven and that are fundamentally fair. And as a national organization, there's a lot that we don't know about the peculiarities of all the jurisdictions that we work in. And so we rely on our state-level sponsor partners and the folks that are doing the heavy lift, really, the on-the-ground work, the turning people out, the meetings, the rallies, that sort of thing, to inform us of what is possible. And we have to work within those constraints, and we try to give the best advice possible to reform redistricting specifically. And so what I want to touch on today is how do we think about this? So when we do our work, what is the blueprint that we use? And the overall message is there is no single path to successful reform from a technical standpoint. That there are a lot of factors that are interplaying and interconnecting, and they can be balanced in different ways. And one of the things that I really want to impart is just how pragmatic you have to be as you navigate the political realities and just some of the idiosyncrasies of state constitutions and just how things have historically played out, political dynamics, demographics of states, and other various unique things. So the first thing that I want to start with is to take a step back, start a bit atmospheric, and talk about some of the real values that are at play. What is our starting point? And that means talking about what do we envision representation to be, because fundamentally that's what we're talking about when we talk redistricting. And what does fairness mean? What is fairness? And so representation, we split this into two forms of representation. First is descriptive representation, and I know that's kind of a technical term, but all that means is we want representatives to look like their constituents. And this is particularly important for communities of color. And there are a lot of political science studies that have tried to examine what difference it makes to have representatives that reflect their constituencies and what they look like. But I don't think descriptive representation necessarily needs to be limited to race. It can also be class-based, and it can be cultural. And so there is a fundamental desire for folks that share certain cultural or social characteristics to send someone to legislative bodies that shares a lot of those same commonalities, and that is something that we think is important. The second thing is substantive representation, and that's sending someone to these legislative bodies that shares the same views as the majority of people that are living within a particular community. And the third thing is what we would call responsiveness. And what that means is the ability to actually vote people out of office if they're doing a bad job. And this is the one, this is really one of the biggest sticking points in all of this. And then in terms of fairness, we view fairness in two separate ways. So first, when we're talking about redistricting, there is a process. Districts don't just magically appear, though given how the process plays out behind closed doors and behind the curtain, it can appear that way. But there is there are ways to ensure that the process is transparent and fair, and I'm going to get into all of those things, and that is in the procedural fairness bucket. There is also a thing, and this is when you talk about fair outcomes, that is what we call substantive fairness. And so when we're talking about, whether how a state, what is a state's partisan profile, and what is the split of the state's delegation along party lines, or do communities of color have an opportunity to elect candidates of choice, we're talking about substantive fairness. Are the outcomes fair? And with that, so those are the values that we hold. And as I mentioned, and the way we approach our work is groups like Fair Districts PA reach out to the Brennan Center, or it's one of the campaigns running a ballot initiative. And they have a sense of what they want their proposal to look like. And there are so many different iterations and permutations of what a good reform that takes meaningful steps forward can look like. And what we do is we measure it against these 5 principles. The first, and the first 2 really, can be lumped together as, you know, under the broad category of accountability, sunshine, and they say sunshine is a good disinfectant, and in the redistricting context, I certainly think that's true. The third, the clear criteria requirement, and I'm going to drill into that a lot more, is about how, what constrains the redistricting process. Compromise is about how does a district map come to pass, and then independence is something that I've carved out last, and that's about who actually draws the lines. And so when we're talking about transparency and meaningful public input, the important thing is not just that the public can see what the map drawers are doing, and that is incredibly important, because a feature of some of the most extreme partisan gerrymanders of the last cycle, whether you're talking about North Carolina, whether you're talking about Wisconsin, or you're talking about here in Pennsylvania, is that things happen behind closed doors. That there are either national or state party operatives, there are consultants hired by that party that aren't accountable to the public at large, that do their bidding and help advise them on how to create as advantageous of a map as possible. All those sorts of things, there are ways to write provisions that bring all of those things to light, where all the data that is considered by the map drawers is made publicly available, where people can see the correspondences, who is submitted and communicated with the people who are going to be drawing the maps, and create a series of public hearings where there isn't just public testimony, but it can be meaningful public testimony, where the map drawers actually have to take into account and reckon with the feedback that the public is providing. In terms of clear criteria, and like I said, that's something that I want to get into a little deeper when I go to my next slide. These are the guardrails that, regardless of who draws the map, can really steer the process in a much more fair direction, and again, I'm talking about substantive fairness here in terms of fair outcomes, not necessarily fair process. And it also provides the public important recourse, because the stronger the criteria, the more that people who feel like the map drawers did not adhere to that criteria can take their cause and go to the courts and argue and state their case. Compromise is perhaps the most important thing of all. There are states that draw their maps using their legislatures, but those legislatures have to pass a map with a 2/3 or 60% majority, which essentially builds in a bipartisanship requirement. And whether you're talking about an independent redistricting commission or whether you're talking about the legislature drawing a map, it is important to build in things that make it impossible for these bodies to splinter into caucuses to produce their own proposals, or at worst, where one caucus that is in control can really railroad the process to its own advantage. And so creating a system that requires compromise, that doesn't leave anyone a clear winner, is the most important. And the way that we talk about it is, you know, a redistricting process done well leaves no one fully satisfied. It's one of these things where everyone wishes they got a little more, and that's really what we're going for. And then finally, independence. And this really applies to commissions, and we don't call all commissions independent commissions at the Brennan Center, though you'll never see a commission-based redistricting proposal that doesn't call itself an independent Redistricting Commission. And so what independence means is there is some sort of buffer from the political branches. There is something that separates the pool of folks that will be appointed to serve as commissioners from legislative leaders. And that can take different forms. In Arizona, for example, which was the original Independent Redistricting Commission, there is a board that pre-screens and creates a pool of applicants, and then legislative leaders can only select candidates from that specific pool. And that model has worked fairly well in Arizona, and Arizona's map has been relatively fair. There's also the California model, which has become kind of the gold standard in independent redistricting commissions, where there is a screening process, but then there is also randomized selection of commissioners from specific pools where people have been pre-screened. But again, what I'm trying to convey is that while, yes, the California model has proven itself to work incredibly well, and those are some of the best conceived designs in terms of getting the redistricting process as far away from politics as possible, it's not necessary in order to create a good redistricting process. And independence itself is not even entirely necessary to take meaningful steps forward. As I mentioned, these are all interplaying and interrelating principles. And if you can't get independence, but you can get very strong transparency, really clear criteria, and a requirement of bipartisan support for a plan to take form, that can be a really meaningful step forward. That's what happened in Ohio this time around. And so the criteria, and in many ways, this is really where rubber hits the road, because this is one of the most enforceable aspects of the redistricting process. This is where if these rules are ignored, the entire map can be thrown out, and either a court takes over or the process restarts. And when we create rules for redistricting, the first thing that we do is we rank the rules. And this is incredibly important. And that's because rules can often be somewhat conflicting. The objectives may be somewhat conflicting, and so it's important to make it clear that what should win out when you have two competing considerations, whether you can keep a city whole in one district or you can allow a community of interest to be kept whole. That is something that you should let your map drawer know what the preference is between those competing principles. And so the first criteria, and really there is not much choice, is you have to comply with federal law. And you almost don't need to put that, because that happens regardless, thanks to the federal Constitution. The first criteria that we try to list is a race equity criterion. And the reason for that is twofold. One, most gerrymanders are built at the expense of communities of color. The reality of politics in this country is folks from these communities are often some of the most reliable voters in terms of partisan preference that there are. And whether it's a Democratic gerrymander or a Republican gerrymander, it is often done at the expense of the political power of communities of color. So we list that first and foremost. The other reason, of course, is that the federal protections that exist are in serious jeopardy. The Supreme Court has been hostile to race-based claims for some time. In 2013, Chief Justice Roberts gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, and whatever remains of it, and it is a Section 2, it's still a very powerful remedy, but with the current composition of the court, that is also in peril. And so we feel strongly that state-based protections are incredibly important. The next one is communities of interest. And communities of interest is to make sure that the redistricting process tethers districts to people that share some sort of economic or social interest. There's got to be some common thread that ties the people who live within a particular district together. And this best sets up representation, because then the parties, and even within a party, within a primary, candidates are jockeying and competing, coming up with proposals to best meet the needs of that particular community. And this could be things like employment in areas that have concentrations of particular industries. This could be based on transportation needs. This could be based on education needs. This could be based on a number of different things, but what it shouldn't be based on is party preference. So this is some other binding force than partisanship. And then finally, we consider geographic considerations. And those are things like compactness. Those are things like keeping cities and towns and counties whole, and those sorts of things. One of the things that you don't see up there, but it is something that we push in every single proposal that we work on, is partisan fairness. And the reason why partisan fairness isn't up there is because it's something that should be measured on the back end once a map has been drawn using these community-centric provisions. So we don't want map makers to be looking at political data and reducing people down to Democrats or Republicans or independents until after the lines have been drawn using these community of interest principles or measuring communities of color and making sure that the districts capture them effectively. And so these are the basic frameworks that we operate from at the Brennan Center when we look at a proposal. That's how we measured the Fair Districts proposal last year when we were partnering with Pat and all the other folks. And I want to be brief, but if you want any more information, and there are a tremendous number of resources that we create, including looking at what all the other states do, various commentary and whatever, please visit the Brennan Center website, brennancenter.org/issues/redistricting, and certainly feel free to email. If you have questions, I was asked to remind you to write it down on a postcard and submit those when you are ready. And at this point, I'm gonna turn it over to Sam, but I would be happy to drill down into some specifics during the open comment period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Yuri, and thank you to Pat for intellectually setting up this part of today's session, today's panel. My name is Sam Wong. I'm from Princeton University. I'm quite honored and pleased to be with you today. Before I get any further, is the sound okay? You can hear me all right? Okay, good. All right, terrific. So what I would like to do today is talk about the kind of work we're doing at Princeton University. I'm a scientist by trade, and really my day job is I'm a neuroscientist, but more broadly, I'm a data scientist, and what I like to do is work with data and figure out what the data might mean in a practical sense. In my laboratory, we care about brain mechanisms. In this context, we're really interested in what the data tell us about representation and for fairness. And some of you may know that I've had a hobby of analyzing election data for some time. It's turned into much more of a hobby in the last 10 years as representation has become subject to a new kind of offense, where this old offense of gerrymandering 200 years in the making has gotten weaponized into something that's become partisan gerrymandering. For the last several decades, it's been racial gerrymandering. And so really, the whole process of creative drawing of lines, let's put it politely, the creative drawing of lines has become weaponized in the last several decades because of partisanship, which we all know about in the last 20 years, also because of computer technology and data science. And so data science can be used for good and it can also be used for bad outcomes. And so what we're really doing at Princeton University in my group is that in the gerrymandering project, what we're doing is what I would characterize as we're coming up with practical bug fixes for democracy. Right? So there are certain kinds of bugs in democracy we know about. This morning we heard about campaign finance. That's a bug in democracy. We have not heard yet today about the Electoral College. That's a whole other topic that we could get into. But there are ways in which our democracy is a little rickety. It worked okay for a while, but in times when the parties nationally are closely divided, as they were during the first Gilded Age, you can get distortions where the popular vote winner does not become president, or the popular vote winner does not elect the majority of a delegation of a state to Congress, as has been the case in Pennsylvania for this last cycle. And so these bugs come up, and so what we really do at the Gerrymandering Project is I would characterize us as being translators and tool makers. And so coming to a group like this, it's really inspiring to see the kind of passion that people have for this topic. I will say in my academic life, it is never the case that anybody claps in the middle of a talk, okay? That does not happen, all right? And so it's just amazing, okay? And so this kind of energy is really fascinating to encounter when I run across it. It's weird. You don't have to do that again. It's really okay. It's really okay. It's just once it's like, I'm gonna go back home and I'm gonna say, guys, you can't believe what happened in the middle, like 3 minutes into my talk. It was awesome. So what we try to do is we try to provide tools and to translate, and it's for folks like you and like Yurij at the Brennan Center, and also for legislators. Broadly speaking, what we like to do is we like to basically, I'd say what we do is we fuse math and the law and data science, and we want to take these three things and put them together and make them useful. And so, for instance, we might make them useful in a court of law, to help make an argument that really illustrates whether some rule has been broken, as Yurij was just talking about. We want to, of course, help legislators and citizens craft rules that are bomb-proof. We've had quite a time recently looking for loopholes. There's been some legislative action in New Jersey lately, and it turns out there's some hidden, I don't know what to call them, Easter eggs or something, but there's stuff in that legislation that we've been fascinated to discover leads to some surprises. And some of them actually may even surprise the sponsors of that legislation. We just figured out that this Democrat-sponsored legislation actually has a loophole in it that would allow Republicans to draw a gerrymander that favors themselves. And you're actually the first audience I've mentioned that to. We're going to be spreading that around pretty soon. And so sometimes these can obviously move legislators and move citizens to action. So in the case of what I just told you, maybe some Democrats aren't going to want that legislation. And so good government groups like the Brennan Center have expressed concerns about the New Jersey legislation. We can put quantitative teeth in that. So those are just the kinds of things we do. And I'm going to try to organize everything I'm going to say today into two large buckets that are relevant to what we're talking about today. The two large buckets are rules and transparency, and we've heard about both of these buckets. So from our point of view as data nerds, we're very interested in what we can do to help with rules and make them bomb-proof, and also help with transparency, and we're very interested in both of these things. And where I'm going to end up today is I'm going to tell you about something where I'm hoping to get assistance from a handful of you guys. So some small fraction of you all are data nerds and really into things like if I say GIS, then you know what GIS is, or whether it's a shapefile, you may know what that is. We have a pretty big data cleaning problem. I see somebody being pointed at, and you and I are going to chat. Okay, and so what we're looking for is we're actually trying to form a 50-state force. I hope you forgive me if I zoom out and talk not just about Pennsylvania, but about things that we're doing for the whole country, and we, like the Brennan Center, would like to provide technical support in our domain for all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, because you never know who might become a state someday. And so it's true. And so we want to provide that support to do the best job possible, and it's going to require more than what the handful of people working at Princeton can do. I've got a full-time staff of 3 people. We're expanding right now, But we're not going to get anywhere close to having enough on-site staff to serve all of those 52 entities. It's going to take, it would take the mother of all Bangalore call centers to do that. So this is very much a crowdsourced effort. Okay, so first off, before I forget, you can read about a lot of what we do at gerrymander.princeton.edu. And if you like, you're welcome to follow me on Twitter at Sam Wong, PhD, or I guess, so you write it down correctly, Sam Wang, PhD, then you'll get it right. But let me, having said that, and I hope you write it down and we can be in touch, let me talk about something that I think people have stayed away from a little bit, because although redistricting is fundamentally about good government, in our current time, it can have partisan consequences. And I realize that for some of you, this may be somewhat less appealing, but it just has to be said, and we have to be, grown-ups about it. One of the reasons that redistricting has become such a big deal is that there's been a persistent distortion in representation here in Pennsylvania and also nationally. And this is just the House Democratic seat share. And I'm sorry at the nerdiness of this graph, but just to show you, let's see, is there a pointer here that I can, where's the cursor? Is that cursor? Yeah, that cursor's kind of small. But what you can see here is that every one of these dots is one House of Representatives election nationally from 1946 till now. And all these black dots are the zone where most elections fall. And these are mostly partisan neutral redistrictings. And in the last 4 elections, there's been something weird that's happened since 2012. And I really got interested in this because I apologize for the graphiness of this graph. But over here, it's to the right of this vertical black line, and that means that more people voted for Democratic candidates for Congress that year. And it's below this black line, this horizontal black line, and that means that more Republicans were elected and fewer Democrats were elected to Congress. And I got super interested in that in 2012 because it went against not only intuitions about how our democracy should work, but it also went against what I expected based on data analytics. And that's because I had not fully accounted for exactly how bad gerrymandering had become in the current cycle. And you can see that this has persisted, and the reason you can tell is that these red dots keep on landing on this graph below the black dots. Even this year, even though Democrats have retaken control of the lower chamber of Congress, they still underperformed relative to history, and they underperformed by anywhere from 7 to 40 seats. And that underperformance at a minimum is about 7 seats. I would put it at about 10 seats. And that underperformance tells you that even though power changed in one chamber of Congress, there is still this distortion where there's this unresponsive quality, where Congress, in an electoral sense, has not responded fully to the will of the people. Now, this can swing both ways, right? So there is going to be a time when Democrats lay a giant egg, and God only knows what's going to happen then. And something can, these things can happen, but there needs to be a response in either direction. And so currently we're in a time when there's low responsiveness at the level of Congress. Lots of reasons for that. Redistricting is a major reason why there's low responsiveness. Let me now get into some of this a little bit more. If you want to read a little bit more about it, I'll skip over this. But I was in the wave of people who first noticed this in a numerical sense and wrote about it. This is a piece I wrote for the New York Times. I wrote a piece called The Great Gerrymander of 2012. And if you want to drill into the quantitative aspects of which seats were robbed where, I guess you don't really want to read about, it's kind of like reading about other people's car accidents. Like, you really care about the Pennsylvania car accident. But these accidents happened all over the country, and Pennsylvania was, of course, the one success story where there was a route towards a remedy, and that's because of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. Now, these remedies have to be applied at a state-by-state level. Here in Pennsylvania, one remedy is through the court. Another remedy that we heard about is through legislation, and that is something that you are going to be centrally involved in. I just want to show you a resource that may be useful to you, which is at gerrymander.princeton.edu, where we give quantitative tools. We give you the numbers to show exactly what it is that happened to advantage one party over the other. And most of what we do is focused on party, but as we already heard, this often touches vitally on communities of interest, because communities of interest are those are the people who get put in the cannon and shot out, and they're the ones who really get targeted and often bear the brunt of lack of representation. And so you can see the echoes of that deprivation of representation for those communities in the statistics that we provide at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. So, okay, so this got a little bit dinged. So let me just say broadly that several categories of fixes that there could be, and I want to zoom back out a little bit without getting into a lot of the details of the Voting Rights Act or Section 2, Section 5, that kind of thing. Let me just talk about the three broad kinds of fixes from our point of view. And I should say, as a disclaimer, I'm a physics major, and so for me to talk about law rapidly turns into go talk to the people who know the law. And so having uttered that disclaimer, I'll say what it looks like from my nerd's eye view from the outside. Roughly speaking, if I think there ought to be a remedy, then what I see is routes that look as follows. One route is going through federal courts. For the time being, that can work for racial gerrymandering. For partisan gerrymandering, that is starting to look somewhat pessimistic. It is a fight that can be won, but the fight has gotten somewhat more difficult in the last half year through things that happened in June with Gill versus Whitford and the retirement of Anthony Kennedy and the ascension of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And so federal courts are starting to look more challenging. There are ways that it can happen, but that's tough. Another route is, I will say that I've always been really interested in the interplay between the national government and the state government, and I will say that this year I've really discovered my inner federalist. I've just gotten really, really interested in state-level action, and that can be through state courts, as you all in Pennsylvania have found out this year. And actually there's a possibility of a remedy at that level in North Carolina because Anita Earls, who's a very well-known voting rights activist, was elected to the state Supreme Court in North Carolina. And so that's another route to reform. And then, of course, state law, which we've heard about, and through legislative action, and that's something that you all are going to be very involved in, I hope, in the coming months and years. So we've been a little bit helpful in Pennsylvania. We did not play a central role, but Governor Wolf did cite some of the work we did where we analyzed different kinds of maps. As you are fully aware, I'm sure, there were different maps, candidate maps that were presented by the different sides in this dispute, and we got very interested in analyzing those maps. One thing that we've developed at Princeton is the capability of analyzing maps, and one thing we have ambitions to do is give those capabilities to everyone. And so we're looking to give the capability to analyze maps with precinct-level granularity to you all, and so that's something that we're developing. And so we're... Everyone that clapped, we're going to be needing your help with that, actually. Okay, so this is going to come up. This is definitely going to be coming up. And so... I know, it's okay. But anyway, but the idea is to, one of our major priorities I'm going to show you in a second is the steps that are needed to put those tools into the hands of citizens all over the United States, including Pennsylvania. You all are a bit further along because of the organization, in part because of Draw the Lines and Azavia and the Committee of 70. And so there are organizations in New Jersey that have really taken a major step forward there. What we hope is to bring that up a notch to the level of legal admissibility, where we're hoping to partner with organizations state by state to allow maps drawn by one of the more technically minded or even less technically minded of you in the room to draw your own map and present it and say, look, this map could be used in a real election. And so that level of technical quality, in the tech world, this is called destroying value. We basically want to be able to make anybody be able to draw a map, not just inside a closed room. So the difficulty is that pretty maps aren't necessarily the be-all and end-all of fairness. This is just two examples of maps. The somewhat space-age representation is population density, so you can kind of see places. And so on the left is a Republican proposed district map during the dispute earlier this year. And on the right is the remedial plan that was actually implemented here in Pennsylvania, drawn by the master who was taken on by the state Supreme Court. This is, of course, the congressional map. And you can see here that these two maps both have okay-looking boundaries. But the 50-50 vote on the left-hand side would elect 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats, and it's as reliable as the gerrymander that was in place. And the right-hand map has similar-looking lines, less jaggy, no goofy kicking Donald Duck, none of that sort of thing. But it, as you all know, just elected 9 of each party. And so you can see here that there needs to be more savvy than just being able to look at a map. And so that's the kind of thing that we hope to provide. And if you know your state, you know that drawing a line between Wilkes-Barre and Scranton has a different implication than letting them both be in the same district. Same for Harrisburg, same for Reading, same for Pittsburgh. All these things, and that's not even to mention all the lines in the Philadelphia area. So here's one tell that there's something fishy going on, and I realize that you all know that there's something fishy going on, but this is just how a fish inspector might do it without actually eating the fish, right? Because fish inspectors don't eat fish. So this is a graph that Will Adler on my staff prepared actually quite recently in response to a reporter, and this is the percentage of races in the House and Senate within the state of Pennsylvania that were uncontested. And on the horizontal axis is all the way from 1970 to the election that just happened a few weeks ago. And what you can see here is that more and more seats were uncontested. And the thick black line is Pennsylvania. Behind it, you can see similar offenses, similar phenomena in Wisconsin and North Carolina, less so in other states. Now, the reason I'm showing this is that these are all, every one of these states is known to be the site of a partisan gerrymander, and so this is not a universal tell. But the thing that's going on here is that these seats that are uncontested are interesting. The reason they're interesting is that these are districts that by and large are so partisan that there's no use in putting up an opponent. I will tell you that all 5 seats on the Senate side that were uncontested were Democratic candidates who won, and on the House side, all but 5 out of something like over 50, all but 5 were Democratic districts again. And what this means is that Democrats are so dominant in those districts that they were packed so tightly that there's no reason to put up an opponent. And this is a common tell in a gerrymander. And we're currently drilling into this to try to understand how much of this is due to just natural population patterns, because sometimes you have to draw a district that represents a local community and it's pretty partisan. But it is very much the case that the person who holds the pen can create districts like this. And you can see here that the number of uncontested races has skyrocketed. And so those are people who are unresponsive to their constituents in the sense of there being only a primary. And also those are places where the voters are packed into a few districts and they do not have as many opportunities to vote for either candidate. So this is just one statistical tell. We've developed other tools. I've gone too long, so I'm not going to talk about them, but you're welcome to come to gerrymander.princeton.edu and hear about some of the tools that we've developed. There are simple ways that it can be done on a piece of paper. We're hoping to work them into redistricting software, but I'm just going to skip over that. I'm going to briefly mention this. This is going to really come up for group discussion, but voting rights expansion is one of the untold success stories of the 2018 election, where there's been different kinds of reforms around the country: automatic voter registration, restoration of voting rights to people who have served their time as felons and would like to rejoin society. And that was, if you know about that, that's 1.5 million people in Florida. 21% of African American adults in Florida did not have the right to vote. And this can be things like selling liquor to a minor or having a fake ID. I mean, it's really interesting what's a felony in Florida. And people who have served their time are now able to vote again. And so that's an example of restoration of rights. I think one untold story is how federalism can expand voting rights across the United States. And so that is a way forward, even if the federal picture is starting to look somewhat challenging. And I hope during question time we can get into the rules, but in Utah, Colorado, Missouri, and Michigan, there are commissions and rules put in place to govern redistricting. We are very interested in analyzing the consequences of those rules, and I hope we'll talk about that a little bit. We are currently, and this is now, I'm on the home stretch here, we're developing a thing that we're calling Open Redistricts. This is a resource for citizen redistricting. And so we're doing a demonstration project. We're doing Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, and here in Pennsylvania. We're giving people access to redistricting software. There's a popular thing called Dave's Redistricting app that's being revised for public release. We have access to Esri Redistricting, which is professional grade software. And we're basically wanting to make these resources available to all citizens. One of the challenges there is getting high quality data. So we've contributed a remedial map to Virginia in a court case there that's a racial gerrymander, and this is something you can read about on our website. And this is us drawing a map using tools we have available. The question is, how can we make this available to you guys? Now, how many of you have used this particular feature that was on the New York Times? Do you recognize this at all? Okay, see, this is how you can find out about partisanship in your own precinct, in your own neighborhood. I have bad news for you. The database that went into this has a lot of errors in it. And it turns out that some of it's accurate. It's certainly accurate enough for about 9 out of 10 of you to get a pretty good idea of how your neighborhood voted. But it is not by any means accurate enough to draw a legally admissible map. And we discovered this much to our displeasure by looking at this, looking all over Virginia. And this is just an example, Manassas Park, which is a town in Virginia. And these are the true districts. This is what the New York Times says are the right districts. And this on the right is what we got. We got a printed map from from the town of Manassas Park. And these colors, blue, green, and red, are the true precincts. And these shapes here are what the New York Times thinks are the precincts. And you can see here that there's actually not a very strong relationship between the lines that the New York Times feature story has and the actual precincts. So we have a job in front of us, and we've done it for the states that I've mentioned. We're still working on it in Pennsylvania, which is where we need your help. We've finished with Virginia. This involved getting clerks to send us their precinct maps, getting PDFs, and we have automated tools for processing of those PDFs to get them processed and into what is called shapefile format. And so we have ways to make this process go many times faster than other groups have been able to do. And what we've been doing is basically trying to create free data online. We're hoping to repackage it, make it freely available. Unlike the people who sold this to the New York Times, we want to make it available at no cost. And so it involves things like one of my guys, Ben, drove across this beautiful mountain range in Virginia from his hometown in West Virginia. And he basically drove across the mountains here. And the satellite photo shows how beautiful it is and devoid of people it is. And so he drove on this windy road to get to some trailer where he walked into a double wide and took a photograph of a map on the wall. And that's the upper right map. And then we took that and we turned that into shapefiles. And so sometimes it requires some work. And so some of you, we might need to go drive into a double wide someplace in the Allegheny Mountains. Moon Duchin at Tufts in Massachusetts has done this yeoman's work of doing Ohio. She and her team have gotten very interested in Ohio. They've gathered many, many precincts there, and we've been helping clean up that data. This is what it looks like in Boston when Moon's group was doing this. This is an aerial shot of a hackathon where her team, her students in a summer workshop, were gathering data and cleaning it. And so we're partnering with organizations around the country, and we're really hoping to seek out partnership. I put out some brochures at the Draw the Lines table, at Justin's table at Draw the Lines, and we have flyers out describing what it is we're looking for. So I hope you'll go and get one of those flyers afterwards. And of course, we're going to make open access redistricting software available. It's going to be able to tell partisanship, tell whether minority groups around the state have a sufficient number of opportunities to elect. And so we're basically developing a dashboard that we hope is going to be useful for citizens to evaluate maps, either ones they draw or ones that they evaluate. And that's where transparency comes in, right? If there's a transparency law, then you can look at what those critters in the state capitol have come up with, and then you can evaluate the map yourself. And so we're hoping to create transparency and really juice it up so that really all of you have tools to define your own communities of interest or to evaluate legislation in a matter of hours. So that's what we're doing. As I said, we're trying to lower the barrier for entry with open data and software, and we would like to take that gerrymander and turn it around, and we want to basically eat up that bug. And so I'll be glad to have further discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Yuri and Sam. Sam, I apologize for mangling your name when I introduced you the first time. So now we're going to have some questions. We already have had several submitted to us. I have a long list that I'd like to get to myself, but I'm going to defer on that. Okay, here's one from the audience. Do we know how the citizen members of Governor Wolf's Redistricting Commission are appointed? In fact, all of the members of the Governor's Commission have been appointed. I mean, the order itself describes them by kind of categories, academics and so forth. But the individuals have already been named. I don't have the list with me right now. One of them is former Congressman Charlie Dent, who we think is a very strong person to have on a body like this, known as a moderate before he left Congress because he was a moderate. But anyway, there are, it includes Susan Carty, who is president of the League of Women Voters, chaired by David Thornburg from the Committee of 70. So those people have been identified. Again, I don't have the complete list in front of me. Then there are 4 legislative appointees that we're pretty sure the Democratic members will be appointed in fairly short order. We're not yet sure about the Republican members because of the way the Republican leaders reacted to the governor's announcement, but we're still hopeful about that as well. Okay, can you address the strategy of supporting an independent commission for U.S. congressional districts only, and if passed, how would that affect the dark money influx? Well, initially I would say, as I said in the opening, we're going to pursue both. We will pursue them in separate bills. So the congressional districts, an independent commission for congressional districts can be done simply by amending state law, statutory law, and does not require an amendment to the Constitution. And how would that affect the dark money influx? Does anyone care to take a stab at that one? Franklin Curry might have been able to do that. I don't know that there's necessarily a connection between those things, because again, we're going to be pursuing both, and we hope to get both of them achieved. Okay, and this is for Professor Wong. Karl Rove claims that California is gerrymandered based on recent congressional results where votes to seats favors Democrats. Is it?
No. So it is, of course, always the case that we turn to gerrymandering to blame the situation that we don't like. And in the case of California, I think a thing to remember is that because we have this curious single-member district system, it's not the case that one should expect representation to be proportional to votes. So for instance, if I win 51% of the vote, I win all of a seat. And if you do that over and over and over again, then it is quite commonplace for 60% of the vote to elect 70% or more of the seats. And so that's commonplace. What's happened in California, I think, is fairly plain, which is that it's been trending blue for a while. More and more people are voting for Democrats in California. And in particular, there are suburbs that have swung heavily Democratic, and a county like Orange County, which used to be staunchly Republican, has suburban populations that have turned pretty hard against the Republican Party for reasons I think we all in the room are aware of. And so I think that natural turning of suburbs against the Republican Party is just the bottom line cause of loss of a lot of seats. And I think there's not any, look, the Republican Party in California is, it has a pulse, but, but you have to probe around for it. And so I think that with all due respect to Karl Rove, that's just completely false.
Thank you. All right, here's another question from the audience. Is an independent redistricting commission consistent with the U.S. Constitution? And I think the question there speaks to the point where the U.S. Constitution says that the states, shall conduct redistricting for congressional districts. That's been interpreted to mean the legislatures, or maybe says specifically the legislatures. But I believe there's a Supreme Court decision that deals directly on this point. I'll ask Yurij to respond to that.
Yeah. So there was a case that dealt with that, an effort to challenge the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. The court there narrowly found, it was a 5-4 split, found that it was permissible, that the initiative process, and I'll take a half step back. So an independent redistricting commission can absolutely, it is constitutional for an independent redistricting commission to draw districts. The question is how can that commission be set up? If a legislature delegates its own authority to an independent redistricting commission, there is no problem. And so in Pennsylvania, that would be the path to independent commission-based redistricting. In Arizona, the commission was formed, and so far in the only way independent commissions have been formed is through ballot initiatives. So the question in the case that was decided 5-4 was, could the citizens, through the initiative process, take the task out of the legislature's hands when the constitutional provision has been interpreted to mean that the state legislatures get to draw the lines. And a Ginsburg opinion that had Kennedy join the more liberal members said that the initiative system is an exercise of legislative authority. And so that commission survived. But Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the dissent in that case, And so we are concerned about, say, in Michigan, where an independent commission was set up through the ballot initiative process, whether we're going to see a reprise of that case.
Yuri, correct me if I'm wrong, but even if that decision is overturned, it only affects congressional redistricting, and an independent commission by voter initiative can still draw legislative lines.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just noticed that we have at least 20 questions, or at least another 15 or so I'm not sure we're going to get through them all, and I apologize in advance for that. Again, for Yuri, can you summarize the status of voting rights at the federal level, constitutional rights versus legislated rights?
Okay. I'm gonna try to paint with very broad strokes in the interest of getting to more questions. Well, one, it's bad, and it's bad because the Department of Justice, which has been the voting rights watchdog since the Civil Rights Division was created way back when, is essentially out of enforcing voting rights right now. Now that may change under a different administration, but it is something that is a reality right now. There are largely two voting rights mechanisms. One is the Equal Protection Clause, which has given rise to the racial gerrymandering claim, and the second is the Voting Rights Act. The racial gerrymandering claim was essentially created as a way to prevent districts that perform for communities of color to be drawn. So it was some conservative white activists that wanted to get rid of districts that worked for black folks, and it was something that the court adopted. More recently, that doctrine has been turned on its head a little bit, and we've seen both in North Carolina and now in Virginia and in a couple of other states where that doctrine is being used successfully to unpack districts that are disproportionately, that were drawn with really high percentages of black voters. In terms of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 is not in effect right now, and Section 5 is the pre-clearance regime. It applied to jurisdictions with a history of discrimination, and so any voting changes, like say in the state of Georgia, would have been subject to pre-clearance by either the Department of Justice or a court in DC. Without that in effect, places like Georgia have been able to pass all sorts of changes to the way the elections are administered there. So that is not going to be in effect, and that's something that we are reckoning with, is the fact that we are coming up on a redistricting cycle in 2021, and almost certainly we will not have those types of protections in places in the Deep South. And how are we going to compensate for that? And then there is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which allows aggrieved parties, either through private suit, or it allows the Department of Justice to sue for something called vote dilution, and that is when a community of color does not have an equal opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. Unfortunately, the way that the case law has gone, and will continue to go, given the makeup of the court now, it's becoming harder and harder to bring cases. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now, and actually one of the things that was announced yesterday, was really a reimagining of next generation federal voting protections. And so H.R. 1, which Representative Pelosi announced yesterday, will be tackling a lot of these issues. And so you know, we're not that optimistic that under the current composition of the Congress, those new protections will pass. But depending on what happens in 2020, we may see some really critical reforms take shape in 2021. Okay,
because I'm the moderator, I get to pick which ones of these questions I want to ask, but I'm telling you that this one actually is next, and I would have picked it if I could have done it. Since most independent redistricting commissions have appeared in states with ballot initiatives, should our reform efforts also include a proposed state constitutional amendment to provide for the initiative process for Pennsylvania? Answer, yes. Does anyone want to comment on the fact that we do not have the initiative in Pennsylvania, which is making our job so much harder than it might otherwise be?
Heck yes.
Yuri, any comment?
The initiative process came out of the last era of extreme distortion and corruption that Sam mentioned. It came out of the progressive era as a way to deal with the political machines that were running politics, and it certainly makes sense to consider that as one something that puts power back into the hands of the people.
More broadly, I think it is a strange time in American politics, but thinking about the first Gilded Age, that gave rise to reforms of the progressive era that included things like popular election of senators by plurality vote. It led to things like giving men and women the right to vote. These were reforms that came out of the last Gilded Age in the progressive era. And so at some level, I think this kind of energy in this room is part of this broader movement to start reimagining what's possible in democracy. And these ideas have been floating around for a while, but seeing people in an auditorium talking about these things, I think shows that there is a possibility of positive reform, and voter initiatives would be very much part of that.
Thank you. Okay, we're down to maybe 2 minutes. A lot of the discussion around gerrymandering is very academic and frankly wonky. How do you recommend communicating about these ideas to laymen? No, please. I mean, I think this goes right into what Yuri has already said about some of the principles that they want to emphasize rather than some of the wonky details, but please.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and it has been amazing to have such a technical and wonky space now have a lot of public attention and civic engagement. That's been wonderfully affirming. But I think people understand, broadly speaking, that there are distortions, that fairness is not being served. And I think people understand how there can be self-dealing and how these processes can be exploited. How you combine that into pithy talking points, it's hard, but you know, I think Voters Not Politicians, that was the name of the coalition that formed in Michigan that pushed through that redistricting proposal. I think that's really good branding. I think that's good messaging. I think it's about taking power back to the people, and I think this covers more than just redistricting. I think it applies to campaign finance. I think it applies in a number of different spaces, like the citizen initiative process. And so I think linking this to those other things that are readily apparent is what I would recommend.
One thing that's difficult is that there's always going to be a need for someone to do the technical stuff. And so it's sort of like food safety. You know, you want your food to be safe, and there better be somebody who has a handle on those technical issues. One of the difficulties here is that when legislators take care of their own line drawing, it does not have an automatic watchdog function. And so I think you notice that I actually didn't mention any statistical measures, and I showed just a couple of maps. I think people understand maps better than they understand some of the statistics that I do, which is why I didn't get into that. And really, I think these fundamental principles of rules and transparency are very important big picture things for us all in this room to think about as big principles. And at some point, there needs to be a mechanism that provides an opportunity for the more technical things to have their input. And you know, it's just, you know, you want someone who's going to read the contract and tell you whether there's a loophole. And so I think that there has to be a mechanism for the technical stuff to get in there.
Okay. Yeah, we're just about out of time, but I want to make one. I'm going to ask myself a question and answer it. And that is, and this is actually an actual question that we heard. You know, why is it that Fair Districts PA in the last legislative session moved away from the original proposal? And in doing so, did we sacrifice our principles, and did we endorse a bill that really was not reform? Now, I think, and this ties in with some of the things that Yurij has said, that there are all different kinds of ways to skin a cat. I don't think he used that phrase, but I'll use that. Different ways to skin the gerrymandering cat legislatively, different ways to construct commissions, and things that you can do if you're not particularly wild about the independence of the commission that you created, still things that you can do to protect against gerrymandering, having to do with transparency, having to do with hearings, and criteria that you build into and you require to be followed. And I think all of those latter things that I mentioned were in that bill. Where the complaints or the concerns seem to arise were over the fact that the appointment process was no longer random selection. It moved to a process that involved legislators. And I think hopefully Yurij would agree with me that random selection does not equal independence. Independence does not equal random selection. And there's different ways that you can get there. And particularly when you do not have the initiative, when you have to get the legislature to enact the reform that you want, that you're pursuing. You have to compromise, you have to recognize that they're going to insist on having a role. So that bill, which we got through the Senate, now, I won't even talk about the regional judicial districts, setting that aside. The other parts that did relate to congressional and legislative redistricting was not a perfect bill. We had intended and fully intend to continue negotiating the details of that bill. We agreed to move it forward in that form that it moved out of the Senate. And we hoped to make further gains in the House, and we just didn't get it done. We ran out of time. So I hope that answers that question that has come up. It wasn't a perfect bill, and the next time around, we're just going to have to keep at it and get the best bill that we can get. Thank you very much. I think we're now going to have to wrap.